Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger with the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our webcast with our founder and chairman, Helga Zepp LaRouche. It's July 1st, 2020. I think the place to begin is with another extraordinary conference which the Schiller Institute had on Saturday, June 27th. It's available for viewing in the archives on the schillerinstitute.com website. I'd encourage you to look at it because everything we're going to discuss today was taken up in depth in the various panels. And Helga, maybe you want to say something about this conference as we get into the various crises that we're facing.
Yeah, the concept of this conference has been, as the conferences in April and May, that we want to create a forum of discussion, of dialogue, to actually bring in the subjects which would needed to be brought in by the governments. And since the governments are not doing it, the Schiller Institute is actually trying to bring those forces together, which absolutely uniquely have to work together to address this unprecedented global crisis. So we had three very exciting panels, one with top speakers from Russia, from China, from the United States. Then the second panel, which discussed both the agricultural crisis in Africa, and the third one, which was very nice, was youth from all over the world, from Africa, Latin America, Mexico, Peru, United States, and European countries. So I can only encourage you to watch this conference.
Well, when we get into this question of the various crises, the first one is the coronavirus crisis, where you still have people running around saying it's just a cold, it's just the flu, even as we're seeing numbers go almost off the charts in some parts of the United States. I think it's crucial that people take a reality check on this. And Helga, what's your sense of where we stand right now with the crisis?
Well, I think, given the fact that we are not relying on one newspaper in one country or even social media, but we are checking with all the relevant media of the whole world. We look at the developments in Latin America, in Africa, in Russia, China, the United States, India. Um, and, I really start to wonder what is the sense of loss of reality of those people who still basically say this is not a big problem, who are running to the beaches, who are not keeping social distancing. Um, I think there is a serious problem of reality loss, because if you look at it, and I actually I know that some of the people who make comments under this webcast have been quite upset that supposedly I have sold out to Bill Gates or similar strange assumptions. I can assure you I have not done so. Uh, and the reality is that this is a pandemic, and it's a pandemic, as we discussed many times, not because of the virus, but because of 50 years or more of criminal neglect of the development of the developing sector. And the only reason why we have a pandemic is because most countries, or actually all countries except China, do not have a health system which could respond. The reason why I'm saying this is not a pandemic caused by the virus, but because of a lack of development in the developing countries and many niches in the United States and Europe, is because the IMF and the World Bank suppressed the development of these continents and countries for more than half a century. China was able from January to March to implement the most strict measures. They mobilized the entire country to come to the aid of Wuhan and Hubei province, and they could contain it. And if every country in the world would have had the same health system, it would never have become a pandemic. Now, since that is not the case, and the Western countries, due to the neoliberal economic system, privatized their health sector, dismantled very well functioning health systems like in the United States Germany, France. That is why, the pandemic hit the way it did, and now it's out of control. If you look at the United States, uh, this is really getting very serious. You had 47,000 new infections in one day yesterday. The key virologist, Dr. Fauci, said that he expects it soon to be 100,000 infections a day, and there is absolutely no perspective because you have many hotspots. You have Florida, Houston. Houston has a huge medical center, and they are overstretched already in terms of hospital admissions for COVID-19 cases. Then California. You have many situations which are completely out of control, and there is no unified national policy. This is definitely the wrong moment, where states should insist on state rights, because this is a pandemic and you would need a comprehensive approach. And because President Trump is obviously in a total bombardment, under bombardment. We come to that in a second. He is doing rallies, which are not exactly the right thing to do under these circumstances, because any crowd is increasing the risk. But you have the same thing in the beaches, in Germany, in Italy. People are going totally bananas, going to the beaches. But if you look at the situation worldwide, it's out of control in Brazil, in Chile, in Peru. India is a complete catastrophe because you have the pandemic, you have the shadow economy, which means that people live from the hand to the mouth. So when you have a lockdown, people start to starve right away. Then you have a locust plague, which is the worst since several decades. All of that means the Indian economy is completely hit. uh, Horrible situation in Africa. The hospitals in South Africa and Kenya and many other countries are completely overstretched. And you have this locust plague, which is now, not only hitting many African countries, but it is spreading to several Asian countries. So all of this constitutes such an incredible crisis that I can only say the people who are still going around and saying, this is, just like a flu, or, I mean, what are you? Are you chauvinists? I think this is incredible. Don't you have a heart for the third world countries who are really not able to struggle with that? The head of the World Health System, or World Food Program, rather, sorry, World Food Program, Dr. Beasley, just said that the famine danger is so big that the World Food Program needs immediately $5 billion to address this need. And he had warned repeatedly that the famine can expand to soon be 300,000 people a day dying of hunger. Now, I cannot understand, and I really have no sympathy with people who blind their eyes to this world catastrophe, because it is only the industrialized countries who have the capacity, who could do something about it. But when you have people who all say, "Oh, I couldn't care less, and it's just a flu," I mean, this is a form of mental disorder, which I think is really a problem. And I know people will be very angry about what I'm now saying, but I have to say it because it's not right, and it's I think it contributes to the situation worsening. And anybody who has ever looked at how pandemics work, if you have one country which cannot cope with it, it's a problem for the entire human species. And this is why, I keep pushing the idea that we need a health system in every single country, on the highest standard. In every so-called third world country, we need a top-notch health system to bring this under control. And that is the moral test of our time. I mean, that was, by the way, one subject at the second panel at the first panel of our Schiller conference, where I issued a call that we should train young people, especially in the United States, in the middle of this race tensions to become medical assistants and then go together with youth from the countries in the developing countries, build up medical centers, medical assistants, give the life of these young people a meaning by helping to contribute to solve the problem. And I really think that this is the only rational approach to this crisis. So please watch the speech, especially by Dr. Elders, the former Surgeon General of the United States, who absolutely agreed with this approach. And I would hope that this idea would spark some inspiration in other countries as well.
Well, and Helga, one of the things that adds to the chaos is you had an effort to make this into a left-right issue, liberal-conservative issue, that the conservative states want to reopen and the liberal states are going toward police state measures and so on. But now we see in states like Texas and California, which have very partisan Republican governors, they're now realizing they made a mistake. So I think it's time for people to come to grips with reality. Now, part of this reality is the absolute insanity developing around this New York Times fake story about a Russian bounty being paid to Taliban to shoot American soldiers. And without any evidence, just a couple of so-called intelligence sources, you have Democrats and Republicans accusing President Trump of betraying the soldiers in Afghanistan. What can you say about this story from the latest update?
Well, my late husband used to call the New York Times the New York Slimes. And I think that that is an adequate epithet, because this paper is lying through their teeth in almost everything they are writing. And this recent one is, has all the characteristics of, fake news, of just yet another aspect of the Russiagate. It didn't work for 3.5 years. The Mueller report didn't function, and now they invent this story by quoting anonymous sources. Great, supposedly that Russia paid bounty to the Taliban to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan, and accusing Trump that he knew about it and didn't do anything about it. Now, this is the most incredible, ridiculous story. If the New York Times has a shred of evidence, they should put it on the table or shut up, because, this is really incredible. This was obviously denied by the White House. It was even denied by the Pentagon. And also, naturally, the Russian government completely denounced it as a lie. But it is being peddled. And if you look at the German media, for example, Spiegel online, they portray it as if it is a fact. Now, I mean, this is completely ridiculous. Antonov, the Russian ambassador in Washington, said, that obviously American journalists have no knowledge about what US and Russian policy is in Afghanistan, because their representatives of the two governments are working together, talking to the Taliban by trying to get some kind of a solution to a war which lasts now for not more than 19 years and having resulted in absolutely nothing to report about in terms of positive results. So I think this is very incredible. And, I think the most telling thing about that is that the former NATO commander, Admiral Stavridis, immediately came out and said, oh, now President Trump absolutely must never meet with Putin. No US diplomat should ever meet with a Russian diplomat again. The Russian ambassador to the United States, namely Antonov, should be kicked out. Now, why would somebody, whose organization or whose former organization is just about to go for a global expansion in their drive to encircle Russia and China, namely the idea which was pushed by Stoltenberg to make NATO a global a global instrument, why would he say this? Now, obviously, this comes in the context of Putin having launched a quite sophisticated long-term effort to bring together the key governments, or some of the key governments of the world in a summit. Now, Putin proposed since January there should be a meeting of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council to address the danger of war, a peace, how to keep world peace, obviously a very important question, and also how to address the consequences of the coronavirus pandemic on the economy, and to develop an approach how to overcome this economic crisis. Now, this is very important, and Putin wrote an article at the occasion of the end of the Second World War, the 75th anniversary, about the reasons why, how it came to World War I, what was the prehistory, how did it develop, pointing to the very complicated oligarchical plot of the whole Hitler affair, that they were betting on Germany and Russia to kill each other. And he motivates the reflection about the Second World War in order to, make pressure that there must be found a solution today. Now, this is, in one sense, one of the, if not the most important strategic initiatives on the table right now. And obviously, to then, have such a new fake news about supposed Russian paying bounty to the Taliban, and then Stavridis coming out and saying, "Oh, now Putin cannot meet Trump." I mean, this is exactly the same MO every time. Every time there is an effort by Trump, to make good on his election promise from 2016 that he wants to improve the relationship with Russia, because, as Trump said many times, to have a good relationship with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing. I mean, anybody who understands what the British Empire's games are can see this through. This is exactly the same what the Skripal affair was, what the fake story was with the supposed use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government, which was an invention by the white helmets. This was exactly what happened after Putin met with Trump in Helsinki. It's the same MO, and people should start denouncing it as the British intelligence is really running out of any new ideas, because they do the same thing all over again. I think anybody who pushes that line clearly reveals himself as an agent of this old paradigm, which is just collapsing. And Stavridis is obviously nothing but a tool of that old system. So I think that, this is incredible. And I would say this is treason, in the same way like these former cabinet members of Trump. You have all these people, Tillerson, Bolton, McMasters, Mattis, who all came out and blasted Trump. The CNN had a big story basically saying, that Trump is selling out to Putin. It's going in the same direction, and actually Biden is, pushing the same line. So you have a real escalation of a witch hunt against Trump with the clear intention to, get him out of office. I mean, there are rumors circulating that he would resign even before the election. And I think this makes all the more important that all countries and all people who have an interest to maintain world peace and to have a solution to the crisis must support the idea of having a summit, especially of the United States, Russia, and China, which would be the case within this P5 meeting proposed by Putin. So everybody who understands and looks through this game should support this idea.
And just to reiterate, the one thread that connects this with the whole Russiagate is the idea that Trump is going to end these wars, pull troops back, stop spending the money, and that's why he was attacked from the very beginning. Now, that makes clear what we're dealing with. And also, just of note, the CNN story you're talking about was written by Carl Bernstein, who is one of the key people involved in the whole fake story around Watergate. Now, while all of this is going on, we still have other things to look at. And one of the interesting developments that we're trying to assess right now is what's happening in the United Kingdom, where Boris Johnson gave a press conference saying that he's going to go with a Franklin Roosevelt infrastructure program and that he's going to end the austerity regime, which has dominated the United Kingdom economic policy since Thatcher. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it sounds nice. It sounds like the right thing to say, that he doesn't want to go back to austerity, that he wants to, go for infrastructure and basically go for an FDR New Deal. I would caution it. I mean, if the British want to change, they have to change all the way. That means they would have to stop the global Great Britain game. This was the idea what Britain would do after the uh, after the Brexit. It would mean stopping meddling in the internal affairs of Hong Kong in order to go for regime change against China. And I would say that the test. I mean, it's obviously good that this guy Mark Sedwill was kicked out. He was the head of the civil service, and in that capacity was overlooking MI6, MI5, and the CGHQ Secret Service, and all they did in the Russiagate affair and the coup against Trump. So this guy was kicked out. So we have to see how that plays out. But if Boris Johnson is serious, and that's an interesting question, um, everybody should know that you can't do uh, a New Deal uh, in the tradition of Roosevelt and leave the city of London intact. So he would have to do something about that. Furthermore, in the very globalized world right now, you can't do it in one country, especially not in a small country like Great Britain. Even if you go for all of the Commonwealths, you can't do it really in an isolated way. If, however, Boris Johnson would be serious about it and he would immediately agree to participate in the summit called by Putin and would insist that the New Deal, in the tradition of Franklin D. Roosevelt, is being made the subject of such a P5 summit, then it could be taken serious and it would actually be a useful contribution. But I think that that needs some more mobilization. But I think that that would be the appropriate forum for such a proposal to take place. As a matter of fact, that is what our conference of the Schiller Institute was all about, because we want to create the kind of discussion which must be the one taken up by such a summit. And that is the full package proposed by my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, a new Bretton Woods system, which includes naturally the cooperation of all countries with the specific aim to provide long-term, low-interest credit for the industrialization of the developing countries. This would be a complete reversal of British policy. It would mean that Great Britain would have to work together with Russia and China to this effect. So stop geopolitics. So that's the test. So before we jump to conclusions and say, hooray, how wonderful it is that Boris Johnson is now doing a New Deal, we should put it to the test. And then we can see if it works out well.
Well, and you mentioned the question of Hong Kong. There's obviously a ganging up right now on the Hong Kong situation from the British and many people in the US administration attacking China when the issue there is really it's not a Chinese takeover of Hong Kong, it's stopping subversion from outside forces. What's the latest that you have on the Hong Kong situation?
Well, after the Chinese government was extremely patient for a very long time with the foreign meddling in Hong Kong, financed by the National Endowment of Democracy, pushed by the former last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten. Now they implemented, or they adopted the Hong Kong security law, which they are perfectly uh, right to do, because Hong Kong does belong to China. It was stolen by the British after the Opium War, so there are things which are just historical facts. So now this law applies for Hong Kong, and it will give a good handle to stop foreign meddling. And I think this is a good thing. And all the people who are so upset about democracy and human rights in Hong Kong, they should keep thinking twice. Do we really want to support terrorism? It was not such a beautiful picture when you had uh, statues being ripped ripped down in American cities, and you had violence. I mean, we are on the verge of a huge crisis, and you can end up in a terrible Jacobin terror, which, if it would not be stopped and some other ways would be found, could end up like the French Revolution, and that is not exactly a desirable event.
Well, and one of the ironies is that the people who are supposedly supporting Hong Kong freedom and independence are saying that China is going to wreck Hong Kong's economy, and yet they're the ones who are taking measures that will damage the economy of Hong Kong. Now, I think we should take up, as we're coming up on the July 4th weekend in the United States, we also have a situation where the economy is in grave danger. What Lyndon LaRouche had proposed, especially in his four laws, was a revitalization of the American system of economics. And Helga, I think it'd be very useful for you to give people a sense of that as we go into this commemoration of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, when you have all kinds of craziness being put forward as economic proposals, but actually it does flow quite clearly from the founding fathers through what your late husband proposed.
Well, I think we have now the choice in the United States, in particular, between a French Revolution and an American Revolution. The great German poet of freedom, Friedrich Schiller, uh, you know, had the hope, as many Republicans of his time, that when the American Revolution occurred, that the beginning of the French Revolution would replicate that in France and then in all of Europe, not exactly in the same way, but in the form of a constitutional monarchy. But then the Jacobin terror took over. You had the guillotine chopping off heads, Robespierre saying, the revolution doesn't need science, and it turned out in an absolute nightmare. Now, if you look at some of the violent protests worldwide, uh, you can see the danger of Jacobinism. Why would you pull down the statues of such people like George Washington or Lincoln? And in a certain sense, the best tradition of the American Revolution, uh, which is exactly that the American Revolution was the idea to have a constitutional republic, to have a constitution which, in the preamble, says that the purpose of this republic is the common good of the people, not only for this generation, but for generations to come. And that was sort of the encompassing premise, which would give meaning to all the particular articles in the Constitution to follow. And Alexander Hamilton established an American system, a system of economy, which was entirely devoted to that common good and to the continuous use of scientific and technological progress to accomplish ever greater levels of productivity. And this has been a model for many industrial revolutions around the world. The basically the same model was applied by Bismarck, by the Meiji Restoration, in the reconstruction of Germany after the Second World War, by in the Russian Industrial Revolution. So I think that this is really a very important moment to remember, because the American Revolution was made against the British Empire. And that is the key conflict up to the present day, because the British oligarchy, the British, George III went crazy literally over the loss of the American colony. And the British have tried ever since to undo that American Revolution. First with the War of 1812, then with the Civil War, where the British Empire allied with the Confederacy. That did not function. Uh, and then they decided, after the assassination of Teddy of McKinley, and the implementation of a pro-British government with Teddy Roosevelt, they changed their tactics and basically said, now we have to subvert the American establishment by convincing them to take over the model of the British Empire as the basis for a special relationship between the British and the Americans, to create an unipolar world, a sort of new British Empire, but with American muscle. Now that is the conflict. Trump upset that script. That is why they have such a fury, and that is why British intelligence from day one said that they have to get Trump out of office one way or another, which they laid out clearly in this article in the Spectre in January 2017, to get Trump out of office by assassination, by a coup, by impeachment, or to get him to adapt to this scheme. Now, the pressure on Trump is enormous, and many people are very confused, because this is really getting wild all over the place. But I think it is very important to remember that it is this conflict between the American system and the British system. In one sense, the old paradigm of the neoliberal system, which is collapsing, and the absolute need that there is an alliance in the tradition of John Quincy Adams to have republics who work together for the common good, for the good of all of humanity. So when people now celebrate the 4th of July, it's a very good moment to keep reflecting on exactly that historical moment, and have a good 4th of July.
Well, I hope as people are barbecuing their hot dogs and beef ribs and everything else this 4th of July, they think about what you just said, because that is, of course, the essence of the holiday. And Helga, I wish you a happy and joyous 4th of July as well. So we'll see you next week.
Yes, till next week.